Between the 1900s and the 1940s, American grandmothers made 30 meals from almost nothing flour mixed with water for gravy, potato peels fried in bacon fat, and pasta tossed with butter and sugar because meat cost too much. Half of them vanished, not because people wanted to forget, but because nobody who survived those years wanted to remember what it felt like to eat that way. Number 7 is raw onion sliced on white bread with mayonnaise that tastes exactly as strange as it sounds. Number 15 uses canned duck pressed into gelatin. Number 21 is black-eyed peas cooked with rice when there was nothing else. These meals didn't just feed families, they kept them alive. Water gravy was one of the cheapest meals a family could make less than a penny to feed 6 people. You heated a dry skillet, added a spoonful of flour, and stirred until it turned slightly brown. Cold water poured in slowly while you stirred constantly so lumps wouldn't form. As the mixture cooked, it thickened into something pourable. Salt went in at the end. It looked like regular gravy, thick, beige, smooth, but there was no richness, no fat, just flour and water with a little salt. The taste fell completely flat, coating your tongue and leaving a pasty feeling in your mouth that lingered long after the meal ended. Families poured it over biscuits when they had them, over bread when they didn't. The bread soaked up every drop until it turned soft and wet, falling apart if you tried to pick it up. You ate it with a fork, slowly, because there was nothing else coming. Water gravy showed up in Appalachia, the rural South, and parts of the Midwest where people had nothing left. Nobody made it because it tasted good. They made it because flour and water were all they had, and pouring something over bread made it feel like a meal instead of just bread. Most families threw away potato peels, but during hard times, those peels became dinner. After the potatoes were peeled for a meal, the skins got saved in a bowl. When there were enough, usually from 4 or 5 potatoes, they got washed clean, patted dry, and fried in whatever fat was left in the pan. Bacon grease worked best, though lard or even a spoonful of oil would do. The skins fried fast, curling up and turning crispy golden brown in just 2 or 3 minutes. Salt went on while they were still hot and sizzling. They tasted like potato chips, but thinner, crispier, with a slightly bitter edge from the skin itself. The texture was crunchy and light, almost delicate. Some families ate them as a side dish alongside something else. Others ate them as the entire meal when there was absolutely nothing left in the kitchen. Children liked fried potato skins more than most poverty foods because they were crunchy, salty, and felt like a snack instead of dinner. Adults ate them knowing full well they were scraps, the part of the potato that should have been garbage turned into food, because throwing away anything edible wasn't an option during those years. Cornmeal mush was breakfast in most homes, but when there was nothing else, it became dinner, too, sliced and fried until the outside turned golden and crispy. The mush got cooked thick cornmeal and water stirred over heat until it turned into a solid mass. Then it poured into a loaf pan and cooled overnight. By morning, the mush had hardened into a sliceable block that held its shape when cut. You could slice it thick, fry each piece in a little oil or lard, and serve them hot. The outside turned crispy and golden, while the inside stayed soft and dense, almost cake-like but without any sweetness. It tasted like fried cornbread, but plainer, just corn, salt, and whatever fat it cooked in. Some families ate it with a spoonful of gravy when there was gravy. Others sprinkled a little sugar on top. Most ate it plain because there was nothing to add. Cornmeal mush cakes were incredibly cheap. A bag of cornmeal cost almost nothing and lasted weeks. You could make mush every single day and never run out. That's why it showed up at dinner tables across the country during the hardest years. When better times came, people stopped making it immediately and never looked back.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Hot water cornbread used only 3 ingredients: cornmeal, boiling water, and salt, and it fed families when flour was too expensive to buy. The recipe was faster than regular cornbread. You mixed cornmeal with a pinch of salt in a bowl, then poured boiling water over it and stirred until it formed a thick paste. After sitting for a minute to cool enough to handle, you scooped up a handful, shaped it into a flat patty, and dropped it into a skillet of hot oil. The patties fried for about 2 minutes on each side until they puffed up slightly and turned golden brown. The outside became crispy and crunchy, while the inside stayed soft and dense, almost creamy in texture. Hot water cornbread tasted like fried cornmeal, grainy, slightly sweet from the corn itself, salty and greasy from frying. It didn't rise like regular cornbread baked in an oven. Instead, it stayed flat and dense, heavy in your hand. Families in the rural South made hot water cornbread more than anywhere else. It didn't require an oven, didn't need eggs or milk or baking powder, just cornmeal, water, and heat. After the 1940s, it mostly disappeared as people wanted fluffy bakery cornbread instead of dense fried cakes made from boiling water. Bacon crackers weren't crackers made with bacon, they were saltine crackers spread with leftover bacon grease and eaten as a meal. After bacon cooked, the grease stayed in the pan. Most families poured it into a jar and kept it in the icebox where it solidified into white fat. When there was nothing else to eat, someone pulled out that jar and the box of saltines. Each cracker got spread with a thin layer of bacon grease using a butter knife. At room temperature, the grease was soft enough to spread easily. The crackers went on a plate 10 or 12 per person, and that was dinner. They tasted overwhelmingly of salt and pork fat. The crackers were dry and crunchy, while the grease was rich, heavy, and coated your entire mouth. Each bite was intensely salty. You got thirsty after 3 or 4 crackers, but you kept eating, because that's what there was. Children hated bacon crackers. They were too salty, too greasy, and didn't feel like real food. Adults ate them without complaint because a box of saltines cost 10 cents and bacon grease was free leftover from the one time that month they'd been able to afford actual bacon. By the 1950s, nobody made them anymore. 5 down, 25 to go. The next 5 include pasta sweetened with butter and sugar like dessert, raw onions on bread that made your eyes water, pancakes with no eggs, plain noodles drowning in tomato juice, and ground beef gravy so thin it was more water than meat. Butter and sugar noodles confused anyone who saw them pasta, topped with sugar like it was dessert, served as the main meal at dinner time. The noodles boiled in salted water until they were soft, then got drained and tossed back in the pot with a spoonful of butter. If there wasn't butter, a spoonful of lard or margarine worked just as well. The noodles got tossed until they were coated and slippery. Then sugar got sprinkled over the top: white sugar, brown sugar, whatever was in the cupboard. The dish came out sweet and buttery, confusing to eat. The noodles were soft and slippery while the sugar stayed granular and crunchy in some bites because it didn't dissolve completely. The taste was strange sweet like dessert, but with the texture and weight of pasta. It didn't fit into any category. Not savory, and not quite dessert either. Children liked butter and sugar noodles more than most poverty foods because they tasted like candy. Adults knew it was cheap calories, pasta cost pennies, butter was stretched thin across the entire pot, and sugar made it feel like more than just plain boiled noodles. Butter and sugar noodles showed up mostly in immigrant communities, German, Polish, and Hungarian families. After the 1940s, it disappeared almost completely. This is number 7 from the intro: raw onion sliced on white bread with mayonnaise that tastes exactly as strange as it sounds. The sandwich was brutally simple. 2 slices of white bread, a thick slice of raw onion, usually yellow onion because it was cheapest, and a thin spread of mayonnaise on both slices. Nothing else. You bit into it, and the onion hit you immediately, sharp, pungent, overwhelming. Your eyes watered from the bite. The mayonnaise barely softened the harshness. The bread turned soggy within minutes from the moisture in the onion and the mayo spreading through. Each bite was overwhelmingly onion-forward, spicy and harsh, lingering in your mouth and on your breath for hours afterward. Nobody liked onion sandwiches. Not children, not adults. But onions were 5 cents a pound, and a loaf of bread was 10 cents. Mayonnaise was cheap. You could make it at home with oil and eggs if you had them, or buy a jar for 15 cents that lasted weeks. Onion sandwiches showed up everywhere during hard-time cities, rural areas, North and South alike. They were universal poverty food. Eggless pancakes proved you didn't need eggs to make breakfast, just flour, water, and baking powder stirred together and fried in a hot pan. The batter was simple beyond belief. 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water, a teaspoon of baking powder, and a pinch of salt. Everything got mixed in a bowl until smooth. The batter was thinner than regular pancake batter, more like crepe batter, because there were no eggs to thicken it or hold it together. The pancakes cooked fast in a greased skillet, spreading thin across the surface and barely puffing up. After about 2 minutes, bubbles formed on top. You flipped them and cooked another minute. They came out flat, pale, and slightly rubbery. The texture was chewy instead of fluffy, dense instead of light. The taste was bland, just flour and water, with a slight chemical tang from the baking powder. Families ate them with whatever they had: a spoonful of jam, a drizzle of syrup, a sprinkle of sugar. Most ate them completely plain because there was nothing to put on top. Eggless pancakes kept families fed when eggs cost more than they could afford. A dozen eggs cost 30 cents in the 1930s, expensive for most households. Flour and baking powder were cheaper, so pancakes got made without eggs until better days came. Macaroni and tomatoes was one of the most common meals of the era: plain cooked pasta mixed with canned tomatoes and absolutely nothing else. The macaroni boiled in salted water until soft and mushy by modern standards. While it cooked, a can of tomatoes got opened: whole tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, tomato juice, whatever was cheapest at the store that week. The tomatoes went into a pot and heated through. When the macaroni finished cooking, it got drained and dumped into the pot with the tomatoes. Everything stirred together until combined. The dish was wet and soupy, almost like pasta swimming in tomato-flavored water. The pasta was soft and plain, while the tomatoes were acidic and slightly sweet. There was no seasoning beyond salt, no cheese, no meat, no vegetables added, just pasta and tomatoes in a bowl. It tasted like exactly what it was: pasta in tomato juice, not tomato sauce. Thin, watery, barely flavored. Some families added a spoonful of sugar to cut the acidity. Others added an onion if they had one sitting around. Most ate it plain because there was nothing else to add. A box of macaroni cost 10 cents. A can of tomatoes 12 cents. Together, they fed a family of 6, which is why it showed up several times a week. Hamburger gravy stretched a 1/4 pound of ground beef to feed 6 people by mixing it with flour and water, then pouring it over boiled potatoes. The beef browned in a skillet, just a few ounces, broken into tiny pieces with a wooden spoon. Once cooked through, flour got sprinkled over the meat and stirred until it absorbed all the grease. Water poured in slowly while someone stirred constantly to prevent lumps from forming. Salt and pepper went in at the end. The gravy simmered for a few minutes until it thickened enough to coat a spoon. Potatoes boiled in a separate pot peeled, cut into chunks, cooked until soft. After draining, they went onto plates while the hamburger gravy poured over the top, covering each piece. The gravy was thin and watery compared to real gravy made from roast drippings. Small bits of ground beef floated in the liquid, stretched so far you could barely taste meat in each bite. The potatoes were bland and starchy, soaking up whatever flavor the gravy provided, which wasn't much. A quarter-pound of ground beef cost 15 cents in the 1930s, expensive for most families. By mixing it with flour and water, that 15 cents fed 6 people instead of 1. After the 1940s, people wanted real meat again, not beef-flavored water. Oatmeal meatloaf stretched expensive ground beef by mixing it with cheap oats, turning 1 pound of meat into a loaf that fed 8 people instead of 4. The recipe was straightforward but clever. Ground beef went into a bowl with uncooked oats, a chopped onion if there was one, an egg if there was an egg, salt and pepper. The oats absorbed moisture from the meat and expanded as they mixed, bulking up the loaf significantly. Some families used a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 cup of oats for every pound of beef. Others used even more oats when meat was scarce. Everything got mixed by hand until combined, then pressed into a loaf pan and baked at 350 degrees for about an hour. The loaf came out firm and sliceable, holding together better than regular meatloaf because the oats acted like glue. The texture was dense and slightly grainy from the oats. You could feel them in every bite, not crunchy, but present, giving the loaf a chewiness that regular meatloaf didn't have. The taste was more oat-forward than beef-forward when families used too many oats, which they often did because oats were cheap and beef wasn't. A pound of ground beef cost 40 cents in the 1930s. A canister of oats cost 15 cents and lasted for weeks. By mixing them together, families could make that expensive beef stretch across 2 meals instead of 1. Children didn't always notice the oats if the loaf was seasoned well and sliced thin. Adults knew exactly what they were eating: stretched meat, poverty food, but filling and warm. Baked rice custard turned leftover rice into dessert, or sometimes dinner, by mixing it with milk, eggs, and sugar, then baking it until it set, like pudding. The recipe used whatever rice was left from a previous meal, usually a cup or 2 of cold, cooked rice that had been sitting in the icebox. The rice went into a baking dish, with milk poured over it enough to cover the rice completely. Eggs got beaten in a separate bowl with sugar and a pinch of salt, then poured over the rice and milk. Everything stirred together until combined. The dish went into a 325-degree oven and baked for about 45 minutes until the top turned golden and the custard set firm enough that a knife inserted in the center came out clean. Some families added a handful of raisins if they had them, or a sprinkle of cinnamon on top before baking. The custard came out creamy and sweet, somewhere between rice pudding and flan. The rice softened further during baking, almost melting into the custard. The eggs and milk formed a smooth, rich base that coated each grain of rice. The top had a slight crust from the sugar caramelizing in the oven. Baked rice custard tasted sweet and comforting, more like dessert than poverty food. Children liked it because it was one of the few sweet things they got to eat during hard times. Adults made it because it used up leftover rice that would have been thrown away otherwise, and the milk and eggs, when available, added nutrition. After the 1940s, people stopped making it regularly, though it never completely disappeared from some family recipe boxes. Pickled beef tongue was one of the cheapest cuts of meat available during hard times. Butchers practically gave it away because nobody wanted to buy an organ that looked like what it was. The tongue came whole, rough and gray, covered in a thick outer skin that had to be scrubbed clean before cooking. It went into a large pot of boiling water with salt, a few peppercorns, and a bay leaf if anyone had one. The tongue boiled for 3 to 4 hours until it was tender enough that the skin started pulling away from the meat underneath. After it cooled enough to handle, the skin peeled off in thick strips, revealing smooth, pinkish-gray meat underneath. The cooked tongue got sliced thin about a 1/4 inch thick and laid flat in a jar or crock. A pickling liquid made from vinegar, water, sugar, salt, and pickling spices got poured over the sliced meat until it was completely covered. The jar went into the icebox and sat for at least 3 days before anyone ate it. The pickled tongue tasted tangy and salty, with a texture that was softer and more tender than regular beef, almost creamy. The vinegar cut through the richness of the meat and made it taste brighter, less heavy. Some families ate it cold, sliced thin on bread. Others fried the slices in a hot pan until the edges crisped up. Beef tongue cost 10 cents a pound in the 1930s, when regular beef was 40 cents. That price difference mattered to families with nothing left. After the war ended and people had money again, beef tongue disappeared from most kitchens almost overnight. Veal birds weren't birds at all. They were thin slices of cheap veal rolled around breadcrumb stuffing, tied with string, and braised until tender. The veal came in thin cutlets, pounded even thinner with the back of a heavy pan or a rolling pin until they were almost translucent. Each piece got laid flat and covered with a thin layer of stuffing made from stale bread torn into small pieces, chopped onion, a little butter or lard, salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were growing in the garden, usually sage or thyme. The stuffing got spread across each cutlet, then the meat rolled up tight and tied with kitchen string to hold it together during cooking. The rolls went into a hot skillet and browned on all sides until the outside had some color. Then they got transferred to a pot with a little water or broth, covered, and simmered on low heat for about an hour until the veal turned tender. The rolls came out soft and flavorful, with the stuffing inside staying moist from the steam. The veal itself was mild and delicate, not as strong-tasting as beef. The breadcrumb stuffing added bulk and made a small amount of meat stretch further across the table. Veal birds showed up mostly in immigrant communities, Italian, German, and Eastern European families who remembered similar dishes from the old country. Veal was cheaper than beef during the Depression because calves were slaughtered young when farmers couldn't afford to feed them. After the war, when beef became affordable again, veal birds mostly disappeared. People didn't want to eat baby cow when they could afford real beef. This is number 15 from the intro canned duck meat pressed into gelatin that looked stranger than it tasted. Pressed duck came from a can. During the Depression, canned duck was cheaper than fresh chicken because nobody wanted to eat duck. It was too fatty, too strong-tasting, too unfamiliar to most American families. But it was protein, and protein was expensive, so people bought it when beef and chicken were out of reach. The duck came out of the can in chunks, dark meat, fatty, packed in its own grease. The meat got picked through to remove any bones or cartilage, then chopped fine with a knife. Unflavored gelatin got dissolved in hot water, then mixed with the chopped duck meat, salt, pepper, and sometimes a little chopped onion or celery if there was any around. The mixture poured into a loaf pan and went into the icebox overnight. By morning it had set solid, sliceable, firm, holding its shape when turned out onto a plate. The gelatin was clear or slightly amber-colored, and you could see the pieces of duck suspended inside like something preserved in amber. Pressed duck tasted rich and fatty, almost greasy from the duck meat itself. The gelatin had no flavor of its own, it just held everything together and made it sliceable. Some families ate it cold. sliced thin on crackers. Others fried the slices in a pan until the outside crisped up. Children refused to eat pressed duck because it looked too strange. Meat floating in clear jelly didn't look like food. Adults ate it anyway because a can of duck cost 20 cents and fed 6 people when stretched with gelatin. 15 down, halfway there. The next 5 include organ meat most people won't touch now, pigeon cooked like it was chicken, luncheon meat mixed with olives, thin fried cornbread that barely held together, and eggplant stewed by Italian families who had nothing left. Keep going. Stuffed hearts used beef heart, one of the cheapest organ meats available, and turned it into something that looked like a roast when it came out of the oven. The heart came whole from the butcher, dark red and dense, about the size of 2 fists pressed together. It had to be trimmed, the tough outer membrane cut away, the chambers inside opened up and cleaned out. What remained was a thick-walled piece of meat with a natural cavity in the center that was perfect for stuffing. The stuffing was simple stale bread torn into small pieces, chopped onion, celery if there was any, butter or lard, salt, pepper, and dried herbs. Everything mixed together and packed tightly into the cavity of the heart. The opening got sewn shut with kitchen string or held together with toothpicks. The stuffed heart went into a roasting pan with a little water in the bottom, covered with a lid or foil, and roasted at 325 degrees for about 2.5 hours until the meat was tender enough to slice. It came out looking impressive, like a small roast, dark on the outside, stuffing visible when you cut into it. The heart tasted like beef but denser, chewier, with a stronger flavor that some people described as metallic. The stuffing inside stayed moist and flavorful, soaking up juices from the meat as it cooked. A whole beef heart cost 15 cents and fed a family of 6 when regular roasts cost $1 or more. After the Depression ended, stuffed hearts disappeared almost completely. People associated organ meats with poverty and stopped buying them the moment they could afford muscle meat instead. Pigeon pie used birds that most people today would never think of eating city pigeons. Caught or trapped, cleaned and cooked like they were game birds. During the Depression, especially in cities, pigeons were everywhere, and they were free. Men and boys caught them with homemade traps or knocked them down with slingshots. The birds got cleaned like chickens plucked, gutted, heads and feet removed. What remained was small. Each pigeon yielded maybe 4 ounces of meat, but 4 or 5 pigeons together made enough for a pie. The cleaned pigeons went into a pot with water, salt, and an onion if there was one. They simmered for about an hour, until the meat was tender enough to pull off the bones. The meat got picked clean, chopped into small pieces, and mixed with the cooking liquid thickened with a little flour to make gravy. Everything went into a pie pan. A simple crust made from flour, lard, and water rolled out and laid over the top. The pie baked at 375 degrees for about 40 minutes until the crust turned golden brown. Pigeon pie tasted like dark meat chicken but gamier, slightly stronger in flavor. The meat was tender and the gravy rich enough to make it feel like a real meal instead of poverty food. Children didn't always know they were eating pigeon if nobody told them. They thought it was chicken. Pigeon pie stayed common in cities through the entire Depression. After the war, when people had money for store-bought chicken, catching pigeons felt too much like something only desperate people did. The practice stopped almost overnight. Olive loaf wasn't fresh meat, it was cheap canned luncheon meat mixed with chopped olives, pressed into a loaf shape, sliced, and served cold. The luncheon meat came in cans, packed tight and sliceable. It was made from scraps, pork trimmings, beef trimmings, whatever the packing house couldn't sell as regular cuts. During the Depression, a can cost 20 cents and could feed a family for 2 days if you stretched it right. The meat came out in a solid block, pink and salty and fatty. To make olive loaf, the canned meat got chopped into small pieces and mixed with chopped green olives, the cheapest ones, usually the kind packed in jars with pimientos stuffed inside. Everything got mixed together by hand, then pressed back into a loaf shape and chilled in the icebox until it was firm enough to slice. The loaf got sliced thin, about a 1/4 inch thick, and served cold. Some families ate it on bread as sandwiches. Others served it on plates with crackers alongside. The olives added flavor and texture to meat that otherwise tasted like salty fat and preservatives. Olive loaf tasted overwhelmingly salty from both the canned meat and the olives. The texture was smooth and slightly rubbery, with little chunks of olive breaking up the uniformity. It was filling and cheap, which is why families made it even though nobody particularly liked it. After the Depression, olive loaf became a deli product you could buy pre-made. But during hard times, it was something you made at home from canned meat, because canned meat was all you could afford. Lacy cornbread was the thinnest, crispiest cornbread possible: cornmeal mixed with water into a thin batter, poured in a hot skillet, and fried until it was more like a cracker than bread. The batter was simple cornmeal, water, and salt stirred together until smooth. Unlike regular cornbread batter, which was thick, this was thin and pourable, almost like pancake batter, but grainier. The skillet had to be screaming hot with just enough oil or lard to coat the bottom. The batter got poured in a thin layer, so thin you could almost see through it in places. It spread across the entire surface of the skillet and started sizzling immediately. After about 2 minutes, the edges curled up and turned dark golden brown. You flipped it carefully; it was delicate and broke easily, and cooked another minute on the other side. Lacy cornbread came out crispy and delicate, full of holes and irregular edges where the batter had been thinner. It shattered when you bit into it, crumbling into pieces. The texture was crunchy and light, almost like a corn chip, but more delicate. The taste was pure corn, with a toasted, slightly burnt flavor from the high heat. Families ate Lacy cornbread when there wasn't enough cornmeal to make regular cornbread. By stretching it thin, 1 cup of cornmeal could make enough to serve 6 people. It wasn't as filling as thick cornbread, but it was something to eat alongside soup or beans. After the Depression, Lacy cornbread mostly disappeared. People wanted thick, fluffy cornbread made with eggs and buttermilk, not thin, crispy corn crackers fried in a skillet. Caponata was an Italian poverty dish made from eggplant, the cheapest vegetable available in Italian neighborhoods, stewed with whatever else was around until it broke down into a thick, savory spread. The eggplant got cut into chunks and fried in olive oil until it softened and started to brown. If there was a tomato, it got chopped and thrown in. If there was an onion, it got chopped and added. Celery, olives, capers, anything salty or acidic that could add flavor without costing much, went into the pot. Everything simmered together for about 30 minutes until the eggplant fell apart and the mixture thickened into something spreadable. A little vinegar and sugar went in at the end to balance the flavors, sweet and sour, together. The whole thing cooled to room temperature or went into the icebox to eat later. Caponata tasted complex, despite being made from almost nothing. The eggplant was soft and mild, soaking up every other flavor in the pot. The vinegar made it tangy, the sugar made it slightly sweet, the olives or capers made it salty. It was savory and satisfying, tasting much more expensive than it actually was. Italian families ate caponata spread on bread, thick slices of day-old bread, toasted if possible, with the caponata piled on top. One eggplant cost 5 cents and made enough caponata to feed a family for 2 days. After the Depression, caponata became a specialty dish served at Italian restaurants. But during hard times, it was survival food, cheap vegetables, cooked until they tasted like something worth eating. And this is number 21 from the intro, black-eyed peas cooked with rice when there was nothing else. A Southern staple that fed families for pennies. Hoppin' John came from the South, where black-eyed peas grew easily and cost almost nothing. A pound of dried black-eyed peas cost 10 cents and could feed a family for 3 days if you stretched it with rice. The dish had roots in African and Caribbean cooking, brought to the South by enslaved people who knew how to make filling meals from almost nothing. The peas got soaked overnight in cold water to soften them. The next day they went into a pot with fresh water, a piece of salt pork or a ham bone if there was one, an onion chopped rough, and salt and pepper. The peas simmered for about 2 hours until they were tender and starting to fall apart. Near the end of cooking, rice got added directly to the pot, usually about half as much rice as there were peas. Everything cooked together for another 20 minutes until the rice absorbed the cooking liquid and turned soft. The dish came out thick and stew-like, somewhere between soup and a side dish. The black-eyed peas were creamy and mild, tasting earthy and slightly sweet. The rice soaked up all the flavor from the peas and the salt pork, turning savory and rich. If there was salt pork in the pot, little bits of fat floated on top and made everything taste richer than it actually was. Hoppin' John was filling in a way that plain rice or plain beans weren't. The combination of peas and rice together created a complete protein, which meant families got more nutrition from the meal than they would from eating either ingredient alone. That mattered when meat was too expensive and vegetables were scarce. In the South, Hoppin' John became traditional New Year's food. Eating it on January 1st was supposed to bring good luck and prosperity for the year ahead. But during the Depression, families ate it year-round because it was cheap and it worked. A pot of Hoppin' John cost less than 50 cents to make and fed 8 people. After the Depression ended, Hoppin' John stayed on Southern tables but became more of a special occasion dish instead of everyday survival food. People added more meat, more seasonings, more vegetables. Potato and onion pie turned 2 of the cheapest vegetables available into something that looked like a real meal: sliced potatoes and onions layered in a pie crust and baked until tender. The crust was basic flour, lard, salt, and cold water mixed together and rolled thin. It lined a pie pan with enough dough left over to make a top crust. Potatoes got peeled and sliced as thin as possible, almost translucent. Onions got peeled and sliced into rings. The vegetables layered into the crust: potato slices, onion rings, a sprinkle of salt and pepper, more potatoes, more onions until the pan was full. A little water or milk got poured over the vegetables if there was milk available. If not, just water worked. The top crust went on, the edges crimped together to seal everything inside. A few slits got cut in the top to let steam escape. The pie went into a 375-degree oven and baked for about an hour until the crust turned golden and the vegetables inside were tender enough to pierce with a fork. The pie came out hot and steaming when you cut into it. The potatoes had softened completely, almost melting into creamy layers. The onions had cooked down and turned sweet, their sharpness completely gone. The crust was flaky and rich from the lard, holding everything together. Potato and onion pie tasted like comfort: simple, mild, filling. The potatoes were starchy and bland in a good way, soaking up whatever seasoning was added. The onions provided sweetness and depth. Together they made a meal that felt substantial even though it was just vegetables and crust. A 5-pound bag of potatoes cost 15 cents in the 1930s. A pound of onions cost 5 cents. Frog eye salad got its name from the pasta acini di pepe, tiny round pasta that looked like frog eyes floating in the creamy dressing. It showed up in the Midwest during the 1970s when money was tight and families needed cheap dishes that could feed a crowd. The pasta cooked in boiling salted water until tender, then got drained and rinsed under cold water to stop it from cooking further. While it cooled, the dressing came together a can of crushed pineapple with its juice, beaten eggs, sugar, and a little flour to thicken it. The mixture cooked on the stove, stirred constantly until it thickened into something like custard. It cooled completely before getting mixed with the pasta. Children loved frog eye salad because it was sweet and fun to eat. Adults made it because it stretched expensive ingredients and looked impressive on a buffet table, even though it cost almost nothing. Bread soup was exactly what it sounds like: stale bread boiled in salted water with onion until it broke down into something that could be eaten with a spoon. When bread went stale and nobody could chew it anymore, it didn't get thrown away. Families saved every piece, the heels nobody wanted, the slices that had been sitting out too long, the rolls that had turned hard as rocks. All of it went into a pot. The bread got torn into chunks and dropped into a pot of boiling water. An onion got chopped and thrown in for flavor. Salt and pepper went in. Sometimes a bay leaf if there was one. The pot simmered on low heat for about 30 minutes, and during that time the bread completely broke down. It disintegrated into the water, thickening the liquid until it turned into something between soup and porridge. The soup came out thick, pale, and lumpy. Chunks of bread that hadn't completely dissolved floated in the broth. The onion had cooked down and added some flavor, but not much. The whole thing tasted like wet bread, bland, starchy, with a slight onion bite. Some families added a spoonful of butter or lard to make it richer. Others added a splash of milk if they had milk. Most ate it plain because there was nothing to add. Bread soup filled the stomach. The bread expanded in the water and became heavy, sitting in your stomach for hours. One pot of bread soup made from 3 or 4 slices of stale bread could feed 6 people, at least enough to stop the hunger for a while. Children hated bread soup. It looked like something that should have been thrown away, gray, mushy, unappetizing. The texture was wrong, too soft and pasty. But parents served it anyway because wasting food wasn't an option. And bread that was too hard to chew could still be boiled into something edible. Bread soup showed up in immigrant communities. Italian families made a version called pancotto. German families made bratsupi. Eastern European families made variations with garlic and paprika. All of them followed the same basic idea: stale bread plus water plus whatever flavoring you could find equaled a meal that cost nothing and kept people alive. Potato candy wasn't really candy. It was mashed potato mixed with powdered sugar, rolled flat, spread with peanut butter, and sliced into pieces that looked like pinwheels. The recipe was strange, but it worked. You took one small potato, peeled and boiled until soft, then mashed it completely smooth with no lumps. While it was still warm, you started adding powdered sugar: 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups, until the mixture turned thick and dough-like. The potato flavor disappeared completely as the sugar took over. What you ended up with was a sweet, pliable dough that could be rolled out flat. The dough got rolled thin on a surface dusted with more powdered sugar, shaped into a rectangle about 1/4 inch thick. Peanut butter got spread across the entire surface in a thin layer, not too thick, or it would squish out when you rolled it. Then the whole thing rolled up tight like a jelly roll, starting from one long edge and rolling to the other. The roll went into the icebox to firm up for about an hour. Once cold and firm, it got sliced into rounds about half an inch thick. Each slice showed a spiral white potato candy on the outside, peanut butter in the center. Potato candy tasted intensely sweet, almost too sweet, with the peanut butter providing the only relief from the sugar. The texture was smooth and fudge-like, melting on your tongue. You couldn't taste the potato at all, it just acted as a base to hold the sugar together, giving the candy structure without adding flavor. Families made potato candy because sugar was cheaper than chocolate, and peanut butter was cheaper than nuts. A small potato cost a penny. Powdered sugar cost 15 cents for a box. Peanut butter cost 20 cents. The entire batch cost less than 40 cents and made enough candy to fill a small plate, about 20 pieces. Children loved potato candy because it was sweet and it was a treat during times when treats were rare. Adults made it because it was cheaper than store-bought candy and it used a potato, which felt less wasteful than making candy from pure sugar. Potato candy stayed regional after the Depression, more common in Pennsylvania, parts of Ohio, and Appalachia. It showed up at holidays and special occasions, made by grandmothers who remembered the recipe from hard times. By the 1980s, fewer people made it. Younger generations didn't understand why anyone would make candy from potatoes when you could just buy chocolate. R.E. Hook 25 down, 5 to go. The final stretch includes crackers soaked in milk pretending to be oyster soup, whipped prunes, carrots mashed into fake jam, wild dandelion greens fried with garlic, and bread spread with lard and salt. Almost finished. These were the meals that kept people breathing. Mock oyster soup was Depression-era fake food soda crackers soaked in hot milk with butter, meant to taste like oyster stew when oysters cost more than most families made in a day. Real oyster stew was a luxury fresh oysters simmered in cream with butter, served in fancy restaurants or at holiday meals when families had money. During the Depression, oysters were impossible. But the craving for something rich and creamy didn't go away. So someone figured out that soda crackers soaked in milk could create a similar texture if you didn't think about it too hard. The recipe was almost embarrassingly simple. You crushed soda crackers into a bowl, about 10 crackers per person, broken into pieces but not pulverized into crumbs. Milk got heated on the stove until it was steaming but not boiling. A spoonful of butter went in if there was butter. Salt and pepper got stirred in. The hot milk poured over the crushed crackers, and everything sat for a minute while the crackers softened and swelled. The result looked vaguely like oyster stew pail, creamy, with soft pieces floating in liquid. But the taste was nothing like oysters. It tasted like hot milk with soggy crackers, slightly salty from the crackers themselves, buttery if you'd added butter. The texture was the closest thing to oyster stew, soft, slippery pieces in creamy liquid, but the flavor was bland and disappointing if you were hoping for actual seafood. Families ate mock oyster soup because it was warm and filling and felt fancier than it actually was. The milk provided protein and fat. The crackers provided bulk. Together, they made something that sat heavy in your stomach and kept you full for a few hours. A box of soda crackers cost 10 cents. A quart of milk cost 15 cents. Mock oyster soup for a family of 6 cost less than 30 cents total, while real oyster stew would have cost $2 or more, completely out of reach for families making $1 a day. Children were usually disappointed by mock oyster soup if they'd been told it was supposed to taste like oysters. Adults ate it knowing exactly what it was: crackers in milk. Nothing special, but warm and filling when there was nothing else. Prune Whip turned dried prunes, one of the cheapest fruits available year-round, into something light and fluffy that looked almost fancy when spooned into bowls. Prunes were everywhere during the Depression because they didn't spoil. A bag of dried prunes cost 15 cents and lasted for weeks in the cupboard. Most families ate them plain or stewed them with a little water and sugar. Prune Whip was a step fancier prunes, cooked until soft, mashed smooth, then lightened with beaten egg whites until the mixture turned airy and mousse-like. The prunes got simmered in water until they were soft enough to mash. After draining and cooling slightly, they got mashed through a strainer or beaten with a fork until smooth. Sugar went in, not much, maybe a quarter cup for a pound of prunes and a squeeze of lemon juice if there was a lemon around. The prune mixture cooled completely. Egg whites got separated from the yolks saved for something else, the whites beaten until they formed stiff peaks. The beaten egg whites folded gently into the cooled prune puree, and the whole thing turned light and fluffy. The mixture went into a baking dish and baked at 325 degrees for about 30 minutes until the top set and turned slightly golden. Prune Whip came out soft and airy, somewhere between pudding and souffle. The prunes gave it a dark purple-brown color and a sweet, slightly tangy flavor. The egg whites made it light instead of heavy, almost cloud-like in texture. It tasted fruity and sweet, much better than plain stewed prunes. Families served Prune Whip as dessert when they wanted something special but couldn't afford cake or pie. A bag of prunes and a few eggs cost less than 50 cents, and the dish looked impressive enough to serve to company. Children liked Prune Whip better than plain prunes because the texture was more interesting and it felt like a treat instead of poverty food. Prune Whip stayed popular through the Depression and into the war years when sugar was rationed and other desserts were hard to make. After the war ended, it started disappearing as people wanted chocolate cake, ice cream, and pies made with fresh fruit instead of dried prunes. Carrot marmalade was fake jam-cooked carrots mashed with sugar until they resembled orange marmalade, spread on bread when real fruit preserves cost too much to buy. During the Depression, fruit was expensive and seasonal. Oranges came around in winter and cost more than most families could spend. Orange marmalade in a jar was a luxury item found only in wealthier households. But carrots were cheap, available year-round, and when cooked with enough sugar, they could be transformed into something that looked and almost tasted like the real thing. The carrots got peeled and diced small, then boiled in water until they were completely soft and falling apart. After draining, they got mashed smooth, no lumps, just a thick orange puree. Sugar went in, usually equal parts sugar to carrot by volume. Lemon juice got added if there was a lemon, a few tablespoons to brighten the flavor and add acidity. Everything cooked together on low heat, stirred constantly until the mixture thickened and turned glossy like jam. The marmalade cooled and went into jars, mason jars if the family had them, or any clean jar with a lid. It kept in the icebox for weeks. Carrot marmalade looked like orange marmalade, thick. Orange, glossy, spreadable. The taste was sweet, with a slight vegetable undertone that never completely disappeared no matter how much sugar you added. It wasn't citrusy or bright like real marmalade. Instead, it tasted earthy and sweet, like candied carrots spread on bread. The texture was smooth and thick, clinging to the bread instead of soaking in. Families spread carrot marmalade on toast for breakfast or used it to fill cookies when they could afford to bake. A pound of carrots cost 5 cents and made about 2 cups of marmalade. Real orange marmalade cost 40 cents for a small jar. The savings mattered when every penny counted. Children didn't usually know they were eating carrots unless someone told them. The cooking and sugar masked the vegetable flavor enough that it just tasted like some kind of jam. Not great, not terrible, just sweet and spreadable. Dandelion green skillet used weeds from the yard wild dandelion leaves that grew everywhere for free, fried with garlic when there was no money left for vegetables from the store. Dandelions grew in every yard, every empty lot, every patch of dirt in the city. Most people saw them as weeds that needed to be pulled and thrown away. But immigrant families, especially Italian families, knew that dandelion greens were edible, nutritious, and completely free. You just had to pick them before they flowered, when the leaves were still young and tender. The leaves got picked early in the morning, choosing the youngest, smallest ones because they were less bitter. After a thorough washing to remove dirt and bugs, the leaves got roughly chopped. A skillet heated on the stove with olive oil or whatever cooking fat was available. Garlic got sliced thin and fried until fragrant and just starting to brown. The dandelion greens went into the hot skillet all at once, wilting down immediately and releasing moisture. The greens cooked for about 5 minutes, stirred occasionally, until they were completely wilted and tender. Salt and pepper went in at the end. Some families added a squeeze of lemon juice or a splash of vinegar to cut the bitterness. Others added a pinch of red pepper flakes if they had them. Dandelion greens tasted bitter, earthy, slightly peppery. The bitterness was strong, much stronger than spinach or other cultivated greens. The garlic helped balance it, and the salt helped too, but the bitter edge never completely went away. That bitterness was part of the appeal for adults who'd grown up eating wild greens in the old country. Children hated it. Dandelion greens cost nothing, you just walked outside and picked them. That made them valuable during times when a bunch of store-bought greens cost 10 or 15 cents. A family could eat greens several times a week without spending any money as long as dandelions were growing. Large sandwiches were the simplest poverty meal imaginable, white bread spread with lard and sprinkled with salt, eaten when there was absolutely nothing else. Lard came from rendering pork fat, the fat trimmed off pork chops or bacon, melted down slowly until it turned liquid, then strained and poured into a jar where it solidified into white fat. Most families kept a jar of lard in the icebox and used it for frying and baking. But when there was no food left, no meat, no eggs, no vegetables, nothing, the lard became food itself. The bread was usually white bread, the cheapest kind available. 2 slices got laid on a plate. The jar of lard came out of the icebox where it had solidified. At room temperature, lard was soft enough to spread like butter. You took a knife and spread a thin layer of white lard across each slice of bread. Salt got sprinkled on top, sometimes just a pinch, sometimes more if you wanted the sandwich to have any flavor at all. That was it. 2 slices of bread with lard and salt. You pressed them together into a sandwich and ate it. Lard sandwiches tasted like fat and salt and bread. The lard was greasy and heavy, coating your mouth and throat. The salt provided the only real flavor. The bread was just a vehicle to get the lard into your stomach. There was no sweetness, no vegetables, no protein. Just pure fat and carbohydrates, enough calories to keep you alive for a few more hours. Children despised lard sandwiches. They were greasy and unpleasant and didn't feel like food. Adults ate them in silence because when you had nothing else, lard and bread kept you from starving. The lard was free left over from cooking. The bread cost 10 cents a loaf. The sandwich cost almost nothing and provided enough calories to get through the day. Large sandwiches showed up in the poorest households, families who'd run out of everything else, who couldn't afford to buy groceries until the next paycheck came, who had children crying from hunger and nothing left to feed them. They were survival food in the truest sense, made when there was no other choice. After the Depression ended, nobody talked about lard sandwiches. They were too shameful, too much a reminder of the absolute worst times. Parents who'd eaten them as children never told their own children about them. The recipe, if you could call it that, died with the generation who'd lived through the hardest years. 40 years. All of them made from almost nothing, because there was nothing left to use. Flour and water. Potato peels fried in bacon fat. Raw onions on bread because meat cost too much. Smash that like button and subscribe, because history like this deserves to be remembered, even when it's hard to hear.